A homeless girl with cancer makes an unexpected request to a millionaire. His response will take your breath away, and what happens next will deeply move you. You won't believe how this story ends. If this story touches your heart, leave a like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this. The autumn wind scattered leaves across Fifth Avenue as Jonathan Carter strode through the bustling streets of New York. His expensive Italian shoes clicked against the pavement, each step measured and purposeful. At 45, he had everything money could buy: a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a fleet of luxury cars, and an empire worth billions. Yet something felt missing, a void he couldn't quite name. That crisp October morning, Jonathan decided to take a different route to his office. Instead of his usual car service, he chose to walk through Central Park, hoping the fresh air might clear his mind after another sleepless night. The park was quieter than usual, with only a few early morning joggers and dog walkers dotting the paths. As he approached Bethesda Fountain, a small figure caught his eye. Sitting on a worn blanket near the water was a little girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old. What struck him first wasn't her tattered clothes or her thin frame, but her complete lack of hair. Her head was bare, a testament to battles no child should have to fight. Despite this, her eyes held a spark that seemed to defy her circumstances. Next to her sat a woman who could only be her mother, her face lined with exhaustion and worry. She held her daughter's hand tightly, as if afraid the wind might blow her away. The girl's other hand clutched a small, worn princess doll, missing most of its hair. Jonathan found himself slowing his pace, something about the scene pulling at him in a way he couldn't explain. As he drew closer, the little girl looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. What happened next would change the course of his life forever. "Are you a prince?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother immediately tensed, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Lily, honey, don't bother the nice man. I'm so sorry, sir." But Jonathan had already stopped. Something about the girl's question had rooted him to the spot. He knelt down, his $1,000 suit touching the ground without a second thought. "Why do you ask?" he responded, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. Lily's eyes brightened slightly. "Because I've been looking for one. I need to find my prince before—" She trailed off, glancing at her mother, who had tears forming in her eyes. The mother, Sarah, tried to intervene again. "Please forgive us. We don't want to trouble you. Lily, sweetheart, let the man go about his day." But Jonathan couldn't move. There was something in Lily's gaze that held him there, something that spoke of both innocence and wisdom beyond her years. He noticed the medical bracelet on her tiny wrist, the way her breath seemed slightly labored even at rest. "What would you do if you found your prince?" he asked, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by. Lily's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire being. "I would marry him, of course. Every princess needs to marry her prince. That's how all the stories end." Sarah's grip on her daughter's hand tightened. "Lily, honey," her voice cracked slightly. Jonathan felt something shift inside him, a stirring in a part of his heart he thought had died long ago. He looked at the mother, seeing the dark circles under her eyes, the worn edges of her clothes, the desperate love in her expression. "How long?" he asked quietly, the question directed at Sarah. She met his gaze, tears now falling freely. "The doctors, they say maybe a month. The treatments aren't working anymore." Lily seemed oblivious to the weight of these words, still clutching her princess doll and smiling at Jonathan. "Will you be my prince?" she asked suddenly, hope shining in her eyes. Before he could respond, a fit of coughing overtook her small body. Sarah quickly pulled her close, rubbing her back until the spasm passed. When Lily looked up again, her face was pale, but that determined spark remained in her eyes. Jonathan stood slowly, his mind racing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it out to Sarah. "My name is Jonathan Carter. Please call my office today. I'd like to help." Sarah stared at the card, recognition dawning in her eyes as she read his name. "Mr. Carter, we couldn't possibly—" "Please," he interrupted softly. "Just call." As he walked away, he could feel Lily's eyes following him. The emptiness he'd felt that morning had been replaced by something else, a purpose he never knew he needed. But he had no idea that this encounter would lead him down a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the true meaning of wealth. Behind him, Lily's voice carried on the wind. "Mommy, do you think he really is a prince?" Jonathan quickened his pace, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out his phone. He had calls to make, plans to set in motion. For the first time in years, the numbers in his bank account felt like they might actually mean something. But as he reached his office building, a thought stopped him cold. What if he was too late? What if this one act of kindness would only lead to more heartbreak? The weight of Lily's hope settled on his shoulders like a heavy crown, and he realized that being her prince might cost him far more than money could ever measure. Sarah stared at the business card in her trembling hands long after Jonathan Carter had disappeared from view. The pristine white cardstock felt out of place against her worn fingers, much like how she and Lily felt out of place in this city of wealth and indifference. The morning sun cast long shadows across Central Park as other people hurried past, their eyes carefully avoiding the sight of a mother and her dying child. Lily's small body shivered despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Mommy, I'm tired," she whispered, her voice weaker than it had been just moments ago when she'd spoken to Jonathan. Sarah quickly gathered their few belongings, carefully tucking Lily's princess doll into the pocket of her oversized coat, a donation from the hospital's charity bin. The walk back to their temporary housing was slow and painful. Every few steps, Lily needed to stop and catch her breath, her little chest heaving with the effort. The shelter they called home was 20 blocks away, but it might as well have been 20 miles. Sarah had to carry Lily for the last 5 blocks, her own body aching from nights spent sleeping on thin mattresses and days spent working whatever jobs she could find between Lily's hospital visits. Inside their small room at the shelter, Sarah laid Lily down on their shared bed. The space was barely big enough for the two of them, with just enough room for a narrow dresser that held their few remaining possessions. The walls were bare except for a single crayon, drawing Lily had made during one of her better days. A picture of herself with long, flowing hair, wearing a wedding dress next to a tall figure wearing a crown. As Lily drifted off to sleep, Sarah pulled out Jonathan's card again. The name Carter Industries was embossed in elegant silver letters, along with a phone number and an address in the heart of Manhattan's financial district. She'd heard of Jonathan Carter, of course. Everyone in New York had. His face occasionally appeared in newspapers or on business news channels, always wearing that same serious expression she'd seen crack ever so slightly when Lily asked if he was a prince. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her old cell phone, one of the last remnants of their life before cancer took everything. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. She dialed the number, fully expecting to reach a receptionist who would politely but firmly dismiss her. Instead, a familiar voice answered. "Jonathan Carter speaking." Sarah's throat tightened. "Mr. Carter, this is Sarah Mitchell. We met this morning in the park. My daughter Lily." "Yes, of course," he interrupted, his tone softer than she expected. "I've been waiting for your call. How is she?" "She's resting now." The walk home was difficult. Sarah's voice cracked on the last word, all the exhaustion and worry of the past 2 years threatening to spill out. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'd like to help. Not just with medical bills, with everything. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to tell me the whole story." Sarah sank down onto the floor beside Lily's bed, one hand reaching out to stroke her daughter's bare head. The story poured out of her. how Lily had been diagnosed with leukemia just after her 4th birthday, how Sarah's husband had walked out 3 months later, unable to cope with the stress and mounting medical bills, how they'd lost their apartment, their savings, everything, how the experimental treatments they'd pinned their hopes on had failed one by one. "The doctors say there's nothing more they can do," Sarah whispered, tears falling freely now. "But Lily, she still believes in fairy tales. She thinks if she can just find her prince, everything will be okay. I don't know how to tell her that real life doesn't work that way." "Sometimes," Jonathan said slowly, "real life can surprise you. I'm sending a car to pick you both up in an hour. Pack whatever you need. You won't be going back to the shelter." "Mr. Carter, I couldn't possibly—" "Please," he cut in, "let me do this for Lily." After hanging up, Sarah sat in stunned silence. Across the room, Lily stirred in her sleep, her face contorted in pain, even in dreams. The princess doll had fallen from her grasp onto the floor, its plastic crown askew, its painted smile a stark contrast to the reality of their situation. Sarah began to pack their meager belongings into their single suitcase, her movements mechanical, still not quite believing what was happening. As she folded Lily's clothes, most of them donated by hospital staff or charity organizations, she found herself counting each item, a habit born from having so little. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 1 dress saved for special occasions that rarely came. At the bottom of the drawer, she found the photo album she'd managed to save when they'd lost their apartment. She opened it to the last photo taken before Lily got sick, her daughter beaming at the camera, long brown curls framing her face, eyes bright with health and happiness. Sarah quickly closed the album, unable to bear the contrast between then and now. Exactly 1 hour later, a sleek black car pulled up outside the shelter. The driver, dressed in an immaculate uniform, opened the door to reveal an interior that cost more than everything Sarah had owned in her entire life. As she gently woke Lily and helped her into the car, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a dream, one she was terrified of waking up from. Lily's eyes widened as she settled into the soft leather seat. "Mommy, is this a princess car?" "I don't know, baby," Sarah replied honestly, clutching their worn suitcase to her chest. "I really don't know." The car wound its way through the city streets, eventually pulling up to a towering building that seemed to touch the clouds. As they stepped out, Sarah noticed Lily's breathing had become more labored again. Before she could worry about how they would manage the walk inside, a wheelchair appeared, pushed by a kind-faced woman in scrubs. "Mr. Carter thought this might be helpful," the woman explained, helping Lily into the chair. "I'm Claire, and I'll be Lily's private nurse." Sarah's head spun. Private nurse? What exactly had Jonathan Carter planned? The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, except for Lily's excited gasps as they rose higher and higher above the city. When the doors opened, they stepped into a world that seemed plucked from one of Lily's fairy tales. The apartment was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Central Park. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the luxury. It was the medical equipment, discreetly arranged in one corner, the hospital-grade bed partially hidden behind an elegant screen, the medication cart disguised as an antique cabinet. Jonathan Carter stood in the center of the room, looking somewhat different from their morning encounter. His suit jacket was gone, his tie loosened, and there was an uncertainty in his stance that hadn't been there before. "Welcome," he said simply, then turned to Lily. "I believe you asked me a question this morning, Princess. I'm still considering my answer." Lily's face lit up with hope, but before she could respond, her body was racked with another coughing fit. Claire immediately moved to help, producing an oxygen mask from somewhere and placing it over Lily's face. Sarah watched helplessly as her daughter struggled to breathe, each gasp a reminder of how little time they had left. Jonathan's face darkened with concern, and for a moment, Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her wonder if he truly understood what he was getting himself into. This wasn't a business deal he could negotiate or a problem he could solve with money. This was a little girl's last wish, and fulfilling it might break more than just Lily's heart. The first night in Jonathan's penthouse was the hardest. Despite the plush bedding and climate-controlled comfort, Lily's condition worsened. Her small body, weakened by years of aggressive treatments, struggled against a fever that seemed determined to consume her. Sarah sat by her daughter's bedside, watching helplessly as Claire administered medication after medication, each one seeming less effective than the last. Jonathan paced in the hallway outside Lily's room, his normally confident stride reduced to anxious steps. Every time Lily's monitor beeped, he flinched, as if physically struck. Around 3 in the morning, he heard Sarah's muffled sobs through the door and found himself frozen, unsure whether to intrude on such a private moment of despair. Claire emerged from the room, her scrubs wrinkled and her face drawn with exhaustion. "The fever's not breaking," she reported quietly. "We might need to consider hospital admission if her temperature doesn't come down soon." Jonathan ran a hand through his disheveled hair. The control he was accustomed to in his business dealings meant nothing here. No amount of money or influence could command a child's failing body to heal. "What about Dr. Morrison? Has he responded to our calls?" "He's on his way," Claire replied, checking her phone. "But Mr. Carter, you should know that even the best oncologist in the country might not be able to change the outcome. We can make her comfortable, but—" "Don't," Jonathan cut her off sharply. "Don't say it." He turned away, staring out the window at the city lights below. The empire he'd built, all his achievements and acquisitions, suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of a 6-year-old's suffering. Inside the room, Sarah held Lily's burning hand, singing softly the lullaby she'd sung every night since Lily was born. The melody wavered as she fought back tears, but she kept singing, clinging to this small ritual as if it could somehow ward off the inevitable. "Mommy," Lily whispered between labored breaths, "tell me about the wedding again." Sarah's voice caught in her throat. Since meeting Jonathan, Lily had become fixated on the idea of a fairy tale wedding. Even in her fevered state, the dream wouldn't let her go. "Sweetheart, you need to rest." "Please," Lily insisted, her cracked lips forming a weak smile. "I want to hear about the dress." Sarah closed her eyes, gathering her strength. "The dress will be white as snow," she began, her voice trembling, "with tiny pearls that sparkle like stars, and you'll wear a crown of flowers." "Real flowers?" Lily interrupted, her eyes bright with fever. "Real flowers," Sarah confirmed, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Pink roses and white lilies, just like your name." Jonathan stood in the doorway, listening. Something about the scene before him stirred memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. He remembered another hospital room, another mother's desperate prayers, another child's unfulfilled dreams. His sister, Emma, had been only a year younger than Lily when cancer took her. Their family had been poor then, unable to afford the treatments that might have saved her life. He'd promised himself that if he ever made it big, he'd make sure no other child suffered like Emma had. He'd donated millions to cancer research, built wings in hospitals, funded countless studies. But standing here now, watching Lily struggle for breath, he realized that all his philanthropic efforts had been a way of keeping his distance from the real pain, the individual stories of loss and grief. Dr. Morrison arrived just before dawn, his reputation for brilliance evident in the efficiency with which he examined Lily. The verdict, however, was crushing. "The cancer has spread more aggressively than we anticipated," he explained quietly to Sarah and Jonathan in the hallway. "The fever is her body's response to the acceleration of the disease. We can try another round of experimental treatment." But what?" Jonathan demanded, his voice harder than he intended. Dr. Morrison met his gaze steadily. "But it would only prolong her suffering. At this stage, our priority should be making her comfortable and helping her enjoy whatever time she has left." Sarah's legs gave out, and Jonathan caught her before she could fall. She turned into his chest, her body shaking with silent sobs. Without thinking, he wrapped his arms around her, offering what comfort he could, even as his own heart seemed to crack open. Back in the room, Claire had managed to help Lily eat a few spoonfuls of broth. The fever had subsided slightly, leaving the little girl exhausted but alert. Her princess doll lay beside her on the pillow, its plastic face forever frozen in an expression of joy that seemed to mock their current reality. "Mr. Jonathan," Lily called out weakly when she saw him return. "Are you still thinking about my question?" Jonathan moved to her bedside, careful not to disturb the various tubes and monitors attached to her tiny frame. "I am, Princess. Very seriously." Lily's face brightened slightly. "Good, because I've been thinking too. If you say yes, I want to wear a crown. A real one, not like my dolls. And I want there to be music, like in the movies. And..." She paused, her breath catching. "And I want Mommy to smile again. She doesn't smile much anymore." Jonathan felt something break inside him. He looked at Sarah, who stood by the window with her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to hold together the pieces of her shattered world. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, but the beauty of the dawn felt like an affront to their pain. Claire appeared with another round of medications, and Lily's face fell at the sight of the needles. "I don't want any more," she whispered, turning her face away. "They make me feel worse." Sarah moved quickly to her daughter's side. "Baby, you need the medicine. It helps with the pain." "But I don't want to sleep anymore," Lily protested, tears forming in her eyes. "If I sleep, I might miss it when Mr. Jonathan says yes. And then I'll never get to be a bride." Or the room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. Jonathan found himself moving forward, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. He knelt beside Lily's bed, gently taking her small hand in his. "Lily," he said softly, "I need you to take your medicine, because a princess needs to be strong for her wedding day. And He paused, feeling the weight of what he was about to say, knowing there would be no turning back. "I need time to plan the perfect ceremony for my bride." Lily's eyes widened. "You mean..." Jonathan nodded, forcing a smile even as his heart constricted. "Yes, Princess. My answer is yes." The joy that transformed Lily's face in that moment was both beautiful and devastating. She allowed Claire to administer the medications without further protest, her eyes already growing heavy as the drugs took effect. But the smile remained, even as she drifted off to sleep. Sarah waited until she was sure Lily was sleeping before she broke down completely. Jonathan caught her as she crumpled, guiding her to a chair. She looked up at him through her tears, her expression a mix of gratitude and grief. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "You've already done so much." Jonathan shook his head. "Yes, I do. Because sometimes, Sarah, fairy tales are all we have left." As the sun rose fully over New York City, Jonathan Carter, the man who had everything, began planning a wedding that would break his heart. But as he watched Lily sleep, still smiling even in her dreams, he knew that some promises were worth any price. The next few days passed in a blur of activity at Jonathan's penthouse. Every morning brought new wedding planners, designers and specialists, all carefully selected for their discretion and understanding of the situation's delicacy. But while the preparations moved forward, Lily's condition continued its relentless decline. Claire monitored her vital signs with increasing concern, adjusting medications and oxygen levels throughout the day and night. The episodes of breathlessness became more frequent, and the pain medication seemed less effective with each passing hour. Still, Lily fought to stay awake, not wanting to miss a single detail of the wedding preparations. "Will there be butterflies?" she asked one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. She lay propped up on pillows, watching as Jonathan reviewed fabric samples for the ceremony. Each breath seemed to cost her more effort than the last. Jonathan moved closer to her bed, bringing a swatch of silk, the color of morning sunlight. There can be anything you want, princess. Butterflies, doves, even unicorns if we can find them. Sarah, who had been dozing in the corner chair after another sleepless night, stirred at the sound of their voices. The dark circles under her eyes had deepened, and her clothes hung loose on her frame. She hadn't left Lily's side, except for brief moments when Claire insisted she at least try to rest. "Mommy," Lily called out, "come see my dress design." She held up a crayon drawing she'd been working on throughout the morning, her hand shaking with the effort. The picture showed a figure in white, surrounded by what looked like stars or sparkles. "Mr. Jonathan says they can make it exactly like this." Sarah crossed the room, her steps unsteady from exhaustion. She took the drawing, and for a moment her composure cracked. The figure in the drawing had long, flowing hair, the hair Lily had lost months ago to chemotherapy. "It's beautiful, baby," she managed to say, though her voice trembled. Jonathan watched the exchange, his own heart heavy. He'd hired the best seamstress in New York to create Lily's dream dress, but the first fitting had been postponed twice already due to her worsening condition. Time was slipping away faster than any of them wanted to admit. Later that evening, after Lily had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, Jonathan found Sarah standing by the window, staring out at the city lights. She looked small and fragile, a shadow of the strong woman he'd first met in the park. "The wedding planner needs to know about the guest list," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Is there anyone you'd like to invite?" Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. "We don't. There isn't anyone left. After David left, most of our friends disappeared too. I think people don't know how to handle this kind of situation. They send prayers and good wishes from a distance, but they don't want to get too close to the pain." Jonathan moved to stand beside her. "I understand more than you know." He hesitated before continuing. "My sister, Emma, she had leukemia too. We lost her when I was 12. That's why I couldn't walk away when Lily asked me that question in the park." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing him properly for perhaps the first time. Beyond the expensive suit and carefully maintained facade of success, she saw the shadows of old pain in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "about Emma." "The hardest part wasn't losing her," Jonathan admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "It was watching her lose her dreams one by one. She wanted to be a ballerina. Even when she could barely stand, she'd try to dance in her hospital room. The day before she died, she made me promise to watch her perform at Lincoln Center someday. I knew it was impossible, but I promised anyway." A small sound from Lily's bed interrupted them. Claire was already moving, checking vitals and adjusting medications with practiced efficiency. "Her oxygen levels are dropping again," she reported quietly. "We need to increase the flow." Sarah was at her daughter's side in an instant, holding her hand as Lily struggled to breathe. Jonathan stood helplessly in the background, watching as the medical equipment beeped in warning. These episodes had become more frequent over the past days, each one a stark reminder of how little time they had left. "Tell me about the flowers again," Lily gasped between breaths, her eyes fixed on Jonathan. Even in her distress, she clung to the dream of her wedding day. Jonathan moved closer, taking her other hand. "Pink roses and white lilies," he began, his voice steady despite the pain in his chest. "Hundreds of them covering every surface. And tiny fairy lights twinkling like stars. The whole room will smell like a garden in spring." Lily's breathing gradually steadied as she focused on his words. "And music?" she asked weakly. "A string quartet playing your favorite songs. The same musicians who perform at the Metropolitan Opera House. They're already practicing the perfect wedding march for when you walk down the aisle." Sarah watched this exchange with tears streaming down her face. The tenderness in Jonathan's voice, the way he spoke to Lily as if she were truly a princess, broke her heart anew. She'd spent the past 2 years being strong for her daughter, but now she found herself leaning on this unexpected ally who had walked into their lives at the 11th hour. As the night deepened, Lily finally drifted back to sleep, her breathing still labored but stable. Claire adjusted her monitors one last time before stepping out to get fresh supplies. Jonathan and Sarah remained, each lost in their own thoughts. "The seamstress needs to come tomorrow," Jonathan said finally, breaking the silence. "We can't delay the fitting any longer, and the florist needs to start setting up the day after. The wedding—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It needs to happen soon." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. They both knew what he wasn't saying, that Lily's time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated. The doctors had warned them that her decline could accelerate suddenly, and the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. "I've arranged for a photographer," Jonathan continued, his voice low and controlled. "Someone who specializes in family portraits. She can come tomorrow afternoon, after the dress fitting. I thought you might want some pictures." The unspoken, final pictures hung in the air between them. Sarah pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to stifle a sob. Jonathan moved instinctively to comfort her, but she stepped back. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't think about that yet. I just need to get through tomorrow. And then the next day. And then—" Her voice broke completely, and this time when Jonathan reached for her, she didn't pull away. He held her as she cried, his own tears falling silently into her hair. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, unaware of the drama unfolding in the penthouse above. In her bed, Lily stirred slightly, mumbling something about dancing at her wedding. The princess doll lay beside her, its plastic smile unchanging, while the real princess fought for every breath, dreaming of her one perfect day. The morning of the dress fitting arrived with a sense of urgency that hung heavy in the air. Lily had suffered through another difficult night, her fever spiking dangerously high several times. By dawn, she was exhausted but adamant about staying awake for the seamstress's arrival. "Will I look like a real princess?" Lily asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of medical equipment. She lay propped up against a mountain of pillows, her skin almost as white as the sheets beneath her. Sarah gently applied lip balm to her daughter's cracked lips, trying to hide how her hands trembled. "You already are a real princess, sweetheart. The dress is just to let everyone else see what I've always known." The seamstress, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, arrived precisely at 9, pushing a rack of white fabric covered in protective plastic. Jonathan had chosen her specifically after learning that she had once made costumes for children's hospitals, understanding the unique challenges of fitting a dress for a gravely ill child. "Good morning, little one," Mrs. Chen said softly, her experienced eyes taking in Lily's condition. "Shall we make some magic today?" For the next hour, Mrs. Chen worked with infinite patience and gentle hands. She had designed the dress to accommodate all of Lily's medical equipment, with hidden openings for tubes and monitors. Each time Lily needed to rest or catch her breath, Mrs. Chen would tell stories about other dresses she had made, keeping the little girl engaged and distracted from her discomfort. Claire stayed close by, monitoring Lily's vital signs and ready to intervene at the first sign of distress. Sarah couldn't watch the fitting, finding excuses to busy herself around the room, straightening items that didn't need straightening, unable to bear seeing her daughter measured for what they all knew would be her final dress. Jonathan stood in the doorway, his normally commanding presence subdued. He watched as Mrs. Chen carefully draped soft white silk over Lily's fragile frame, noting how the fabric seemed to emphasize her increasing frailty. The dress was beautiful, exactly as Lily had drawn it, but seeing it come to life made everything feel terrifyingly real. "Look, Mr. Jonathan," Lily called out during a moment of energy, "I'm sparkling." Indeed, Mrs. Chen had incorporated tiny crystals into the fabric that caught the light with every movement. Lily's face lit up as she watched them twinkle, momentarily forgetting her pain and exhaustion. The joy was short-lived. Halfway through the fitting, Lily's oxygen levels dropped dramatically. Claire rushed forward as the little girl began gasping for air, her lips taking on a bluish tinge. Mrs. Chen stepped back quickly, her face etched with concern as medical equipment began beeping in alarm. "Baby, stay with me," Sarah pleaded, rushing to her daughter's side. "Just breathe, nice and slow." "Like we practiced, remember?" Jonathan had already called for Dr. Morrison, who arrived within minutes. The doctor worked quickly, adjusting medications and oxygen flow while everyone else stood helplessly by. Mrs. Chen quietly began packing up her supplies, leaving the partially fitted dress carefully arranged on a mannequin she had brought. "I'll finish it at my workshop," she whispered to Jonathan. "It will be ready by tomorrow evening." After the crisis passed, Lily lay completely drained, barely able to keep her eyes open, but she fought against the exhaustion, turning her head slightly toward Jonathan. "Did you see?" she asked weakly. "Did you see how pretty it is?" Jonathan moved to her bedside, taking her tiny hand in his. "The most beautiful dress I've ever seen," he assured her, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. "Perfect for my bride." Later that afternoon, when Lily had finally succumbed to sleep, Dr. Morrison pulled Jonathan and Sarah aside for a conversation they had been dreading. "The wedding needs to happen within the next 48 hours, he said quietly but firmly. "Her organs are beginning to fail. The medications can only do so much at this point. If you want her to be able to participate—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah turned away, pressing her fist against her mouth to stifle a sob. Jonathan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, addressing the doctor with forced composure. "We'll be ready tomorrow evening. Everything is arranged. The flowers, the music, the photographer." Dr. Morrison nodded gravely. "I'll have additional medical equipment brought in, and I'll stay on site throughout the ceremony. We'll make her as comfortable as possible, but you should be prepared. She may not have the strength to stay awake for long." After the doctor left, Sarah collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with silent sobs. Jonathan knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "Sarah, look at me," he said gently. "We're going to give her this. One perfect moment, something for her to hold on to, and—" He hesitated before continuing. "Something for you to remember." "I can't," she whispered brokenly. "I can't watch my baby in a wedding dress knowing it's really a—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the word shroud hanging unspoken between them. Jonathan pulled her into his arms, letting her cry against his shoulder. His own tears fell silently as he held her, the weight of tomorrow pressing down on them both. In her bed, Lily stirred slightly, mumbling in her sleep about dancing at her wedding. Her princess doll had fallen to the floor, and when Jonathan picked it up, he noticed that its plastic crown had broken. Without thinking, he slipped off his expensive watch and carefully removed the small gold band that had been his father's, the only thing he had kept from his impoverished childhood. With gentle fingers, he fashioned it into a tiny crown for the doll. "There," he whispered, placing the doll back in Lily's arms. "Every princess needs her crown." As night fell over the city, the penthouse buzzed with quiet activity. Florists began bringing in hundreds of flowers, their sweet scent mixing with the sterile hospital smell that had permeated the space. Musicians arrived to test the acoustics, their violin cases carried like precious cargo. Every person who entered moved with hushed reverence, aware that they were preparing not just for a wedding, but for a final wish. Jonathan stood at the window, watching the city lights blur through his tears. Tomorrow, he would fulfill his promise to Lily. He would be her prince, give her the fairy tale she dreamed of. But tonight, he was just a man watching another family face the same loss he had experienced all those years ago with Emma, feeling just as helpless now as he had then. In the reflection of the glass, he could see Sarah sitting by Lily's bed, singing softly as she had every night since they arrived. The lullaby drifted through the apartment, mixing with the sound of flowers being arranged and music stands being assembled, a bittersweet symphony of love and loss. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows with an almost cruel brightness. Lily had survived another difficult night, but the toll on her small body was evident. Her breathing was more labored than ever, and even the slightest movement seemed to drain what little energy she had left. Claire had been up all night, carefully monitoring Lily's vital signs and adjusting medications to keep her stable. Dr. Morrison arrived before sunrise, bringing additional medical equipment that was discreetly arranged behind elegant screens. The living room had been transformed into a fairy tale setting, with thousands of pink roses and white lilies creating an enchanted garden effect. Tiny lights twinkled everywhere, their soft glow reflecting off crystal vases and silk ribbons. "Is it time yet?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft beeping of monitors. She had been asking the same question every few minutes since midnight, fighting against the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. Sarah, who hadn't left her daughter's side, tried to smile through her tears. "Soon, baby. We need to wait for your dress to arrive. Would you like to try to eat something first?" Lily shook her head slightly, the movement causing her to wince in pain. "Not hungry. Don't want to sleep either. Might miss it." Jonathan appeared in the doorway, already dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He had dark circles under his eyes from another sleepless night, but his voice was steady as he addressed his tiny bride. "No one's starting without you, Princess. I promise." Mrs. Chen arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, carrying the completed wedding dress as if it were made of spun gold. The sight of it brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. It was everything Lily had dreamed of and more. The silk seemed to float like clouds, and the crystals caught the morning light in rainbow patterns that danced across the walls. Getting Lily into the dress proved to be an enormous challenge. Every movement caused her pain, and her oxygen levels kept dropping dangerously low. It took nearly 2 hours, with Claire constantly monitoring her vitals and Dr. Morrison standing by with emergency medications. Mrs. Chen worked with infinite patience, adjusting and readjusting until every tube and wire was hidden beneath layers of silk and lace. "Look, Mommy," Lily whispered once the dress was finally on. "I'm a real bride now." Sarah had to turn away, unable to bear the mixture of joy and devastation on her daughter's face. Jonathan stepped forward, filling the silence with gentle words of admiration. "The most beautiful bride I've ever seen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But something's missing." He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a delicate tiara, sized perfectly for Lily's small head. Every bride needs her crown. The tiara was a masterpiece of intricate metalwork, with tiny diamonds that matched the crystals on her dress. As Jonathan carefully placed it on her head, Lily's face lit up with a joy that momentarily masked her pain. "Now I'm really a princess," she breathed, then immediately started coughing. Claire rushed forward with the oxygen mask, but Lily weakly pushed it away. "No, please, don't want to mess up my makeup." The makeup artist, who had arrived earlier to give Lily the princess treatment she'd dreamed of, had used the lightest touch possible to add a hint of color to her pale cheeks and a shimmer to her lips. Even that small effort had exhausted Lily, but she had insisted on looking just like the princesses in the movies. As the afternoon progressed, Lily's condition continued to deteriorate. Dr. Morrison pulled Jonathan aside during one particularly bad episode. "We need to start now," he said urgently. "She's fighting with everything she has, but she's getting weaker by the minute. If we wait much longer..." Jonathan nodded, his heart heavy. "I'll tell everyone to take their places." The string quartet began playing softly as guests, mostly medical staff who had cared for Lily over the years, along with a few of Jonathan's most trusted employees, took their seats in the transformed living room. The flowers released their sweet fragrance into the air, mixing with the antiseptic smell that no amount of decoration could quite mask. Sarah helped adjust Lily's dress one final time, her hands trembling as she smoothed the silk. "Are you ready, baby?" Lily nodded weakly, then looked up at her mother with sudden clarity. "Mommy, don't cry. This is happy. I get to be a princess today." Those words nearly broke Sarah completely. She had to step away for a moment, pressing her hands against her mouth to stifle her sobs. Claire quickly moved in to check Lily's vital signs one more time before the ceremony began. Jonathan stood at the front of the room, next to an ornate arch covered in flowers. His hands were clasped tightly behind his back to hide their trembling. The string quartet began playing the wedding march, and everyone rose to their feet. The moment Lily appeared in her wheelchair, pushed by Sarah with Claire walking alongside managing the medical equipment, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. She looked ethereal in her white dress, the tiara sparkling on her bare head, a smile of pure joy lighting up her face, despite the obvious pain she was in. As they made their way down the aisle, Lily's breathing became more labored. Halfway to the arch, she suddenly gasped, her small body convulsing with the effort to draw air into her failing lungs. The music stopped abruptly as Claire rushed forward with the oxygen mask. "No," Lily protested weakly, even as her lips began turning blue. "Please, want to finish, want to be a bride." Dr. Morrison moved quickly to her side, checking her vital signs with grave concern. "Lily, sweetheart, we need to help you breathe. Just a minute more," she pleaded, her eyes fixed on Jonathan. "Please, almost there." Sarah looked desperately between the doctor and her daughter, torn between medical necessity and her child's final wish. It was Jonathan who made the decision, stepping down from the arch to kneel beside Lily's wheelchair. "The bride can't come to me," he said gently, taking her tiny hand in his. "Then I'll come to her. Right here is perfect." The officiant, understanding immediately, moved to stand beside them. The ceremony would happen right there, halfway down the aisle, with medical equipment beeping in the background and Lily fighting for every breath. As the officiant began speaking, Lily's eyes started to flutter, exhaustion finally overtaking her determination. But she forced them open again, focusing on Jonathan with every bit of strength she had left. "Stay with me, princess," he whispered, squeezing her hand gently. "We're almost there." The officiant's words seemed to float in the air as Jonathan held Lily's fragile hand. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her eyes never leaving his face as she fought to stay present for this moment. When it came time for the rings, Jonathan carefully slipped a delicate gold band onto her tiny finger, a special piece he had commissioned, sized perfectly for her small hand. "I do," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with pure joy. The words seemed to take all her remaining strength, but her smile never wavered. As Jonathan leaned down to place a gentle kiss on her forehead, something extraordinary happened. Lily's eyes suddenly brightened with a clarity that hadn't been there before, and her voice grew stronger. "Mr. Jonathan," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "thank you for making me a real princess." Then she turned to her mother. "Mommy, don't be sad anymore. I'll always be your princess too." The room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of medical equipment. Dr. Morrison moved forward quickly, checking Lily's vitals with a look of astonishment on his face. Her oxygen levels had stabilized, and her heart rate was stronger than it had been in days. "I don't understand," he muttered, rechecking his readings. "This is unexpected." Claire rushed forward with additional monitoring equipment, confirming what seemed impossible. Lily's vital signs were improving. The constant pain that had marked her features for so long seemed to ease, replaced by a peaceful calm. Sarah knelt beside her daughter's wheelchair, hardly daring to hope. "Baby, how do you feel?" "Better, Mommy," Lily replied, her voice growing stronger by the minute. "The pain is going away." Dr. Morrison ordered immediate tests, and what they revealed left the medical team stunned. The aggressive progression of Lily's condition had somehow slowed. While she wasn't cured, the cancer was still present. Something had shifted in her body's response to the treatments. "I've seen similar cases," Dr. Morrison explained later that evening, after running multiple tests. "Rare, but documented. Sometimes, when a patient's emotional state dramatically improves, it can trigger changes in their body's immune response. We call it the will to live effect. It's not a cure, but it can buy precious time. In the days that followed, Lily continued to show improvement. She was able to sit up for longer periods, eat small amounts of food, and even laugh without triggering coughing fits. The medical team adjusted her treatment plan, and for the first time in months, they began talking about possibilities instead of limitations. One evening, about a week after the wedding, Jonathan found Sarah standing in what had become their usual spot by the window. The flowers from the ceremony had been preserved, their sweet scent still lingering in the air. "The latest test results came back," she said without turning around. "They're calling it a temporary remission. They don't know how long it will last, but—" Her voice broke slightly. "But they're talking about months now, maybe even a year. Time we never thought we'd have." Jonathan moved to stand beside her. Time for new memories. Sarah turned to face him, tears in her eyes, but a smile on her face. "You did this. You gave her something to live for, a reason to fight." "No," Jonathan replied softly. "She gave me something, a reason to remember who I used to be, before money and success became more important than moments like these." From Lily's room, they could hear her giggling as Claire read her a bedtime story. Her laughter, once so rare, now filled the penthouse regularly. She was still small and fragile, still needed constant medical care, but there was a new light in her eyes, the light of possibility. Jonathan had already begun making plans. He'd established a foundation in Lily's name, focused on granting wishes for children with terminal illnesses. The penthouse was being renovated to include a permanent medical suite, ensuring Lily would have everything she needed while maintaining the comfort of a home. But more than that, he had found something he thought he'd lost forever: a family. Not in the traditional sense, but in the way that truly mattered. In Lily's brave battle and Sarah's unwavering strength, he had rediscovered parts of himself he thought had died with Emma all those years ago. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "my sister used to say that real magic isn't in fairy tales. It's in the moments when we choose love over fear." I never really understood what she meant until now. Sarah reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Lily asks about Emma sometimes. She says she knows she would have liked her. She would have loved her," Jonathan replied, his voice thick with emotion, "just like I've grown to love you both." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Sarah's hand tightened in his, and when she looked up at him, there was an understanding in her eyes that needed no explanation. In her room, Lily had fallen asleep clutching her princess doll. The tiny crown Jonathan had made still perched perfectly on its head. Her medical monitors beeped steadily, but now they seemed to mark time forward instead of counting it down. On her bedside table, a framed photo from the wedding showed her beaming at the camera, every inch the princess she had dreamed of being. Life was still fragile, still uncertain. But in that uncertainty, they had found something beautiful: the knowledge that love, in all its forms, could create miracles of its own kind. Not the kind that cure all ills or guarantee happy endings, but the kind that make each moment, no matter how brief, worth fighting for. Jonathan looked out at the city lights, still holding Sarah's hand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new hopes. But for now, in this moment, they had what they needed: each other and the love of a little girl who had taught them all what it truly means to believe in magic. As if reading his thoughts, Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. "She was right, you know. You really are a prince." Jonathan smiled, thinking of all the wealth he'd accumulated over the years and how none of it had brought him the peace he'd found in this unexpected family. "No," he said softly. "I'm just someone who finally learned what matters most." From Lily's room, they could hear her mumbling in her sleep, something about dancing at another wedding someday. Sarah and Jonathan exchanged a glance, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The city continued its endless rhythm below, unaware of the small miracle that had unfolded in the penthouse above. But for those who had witnessed it, life would never be quite the same. They had discovered that sometimes the greatest magic isn't in grand gestures or fairy tale endings, but in the simple choice to love fully, even in the face of loss. For in that choice, they had found something rare and precious, not just hope, but the courage to keep hoping, one day at a time.